Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. I am Sam Levy with the CCO, transforming college students to transform the world. And of course, I'm here as always with the one and only Byron Borger of Hearts and Minds Books. Byron, how you doing?
I'm doing okay today. It's good to be here talking about books with you, Sam. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing well. Leading up to Thanksgiving here, and thankful for you and for great books to dialogue about. What do you have for us today?
Well, in our latest book notes newsletter that goes out every week or so from Hearts and Minds, I just said that in passing. I wasn't even really thinking about Thanksgiving exactly, but yeah, as people are listening to this, it might be close to Thanksgiving. I just mentioned how thankful we are for writers who spend their time, a year or more, sometimes a lifetime, pouring themselves into creating a book, and then publishers edit it and work on it, and artists make covers, and then the sales reps tell us about it, and then I get to tell you guys about it. So it's a pretty neat supply chain we're a part of in this web of interconnection where there's all these different people involved, from the writer to the bookseller to the reader, who then answers back and puts a comment of whether they like the book or not. It really is a massive, fascinating project, this whole publishing industry we're a part of. The Christian book world has always been important ever since there were books. The great Apostle Paul is dying in Rome, and he writes one of his last letters to young Timothy, and he orders more books from him. So that's just the beginning there in the book of Acts, and under the Roman Empire, and he's writing all these subversive letters about these countercultural communities that are forming, and he uses books and quotes and citations to study up and do well. So if the Apostle Paul needed to do that in his time, we need to certainly do it in ours. And speaking of kind of the culture of the first century and Paul needing books to navigate all that, I think of Acts 17 and him quoting the pagan poet, that's sort of what we're going to talk about here today. I got 3 books. I'd like to talk about more, but 3 books under this rubric that some people use. Now, it might be new phrase for some people in the CCO listening to this, or some of our other guests, but the phrase is cultural apologetics. Apologetics, for those that don't know, is sort of defending the faith. The Apostle Paul equips us and calls us to be ready to defend the faith, to take a stand for the truth of the gospel. And there's always been people who have made kind of their ministry making a good claim, making a good case that the gospel makes sense, that it's reasonable, that Jesus really did raise from the dead, that this isn't just goofy religion, but this is actually the way the universe works. And so apologetics is that school of thought that says we need to defend the faith and make a case for its reasonableness so that listeners could feel compelled and persuaded, not just taking a leap of blind faith because your mom took you to Sunday school, but actually because it makes sense, because it's true in the truths of the universe. So that apologetics is that school of thought that says we need to argue for the faith. Well, more and more people come to realize, and there's a sort of school of thought about apologetics that says if it was ever true, not that it even never was, but if it was ever true that you could argue people into the kingdom of God, that you could convince people by making a claim, and that's all you had to do is just give them the facts of the gospel, and then smart people would say, oh yeah, it makes sense, I'm going to buy in. If that was ever the case in a post-Christian, postmodern world, that's certainly not the case anymore. People are no longer skeptical of the gospel. They're skeptical of notions of truth. And so to even say this is true, people will say, well, so what? And whose truth anyway? So the notion of kind of arguing people by persuading them to make an intellectually reasonable case that Christ is who he said he was, that within the different worldview options that are out there, that Christianity rises to the top and is the most reasonable and compelling. If that was ever true, it's certainly not anymore. And so we need to understand the gospel as it relates to the culture in which we're in. And so that phrase, cultural apologetics, seems to mean a couple of things. It seems to mean both a culturally savvy way to do apologetics. In other words, you're arguing for the truth claims of the gospel, yes, but doing it in a way that is attentive to the ideologies of the land, to the culture of the day, to the languages and mores of the generations you're speaking with. And that may change within the place you live, in the rural or urban place you live, the racial makeup of your community. So there's a lot of different cultures out there. That's one of the things that have changed in our cultural apologetics, is there's no one Western culture anymore. And so within the cultures of our place, we need to be savvy to those things as we share our deepest beliefs about the gospel. But it also means some other things too. It does mean, as it's developed sort of a way to talk about and analyze the culture, primary motifs of Western culture, and what may or may not be wrong with them, and find an open door to sort of let the light shine in through the cracks. So cultural apologetics is sort of a slippery phrase, but there's a bunch of books that have come out in recent years about this sort of more savvy way to do cultural apologetics that can be compelling to help people in the modern Western world, wherever they find themselves, to sort of make sense of things. So as the CCO tries to evangelize young people on campuses or disciple young Christian students who have come to us, we need to be aware of how to do that in a way that's effective and appropriate. Does that sound right to you, Sam? Does that kind of cultural apologetics language sound like something you've heard of before?
Yeah, it really does. One thing in our work in the CCO on college campuses, if you're around CCO folks for any length of time, you're likely to hear the phrase contextual ministry. That's always been of value to the way that we go about ministry on a college campus. That is really not, here's this model or this system, and we're going to go to a campus and we're going to implement that model onto this campus. But it's, let's go to campus, let's get to know this campus, let's get to know the unique culture of this particular campus and this particular student body, and what is important here. What are the values? What are the opportunities that exist on this campus? What are the inroads for the gospel here? What are the idols that are worshipped on this campus? What are the particular ways that students are going to be responsive and receptive, that we're going to be able to be effective in the way that we do ministry? And so it's even at that kind of micro level, not even just, as you were saying, not just these macro cultures of the West or of the United States, but even on a particular college campus in a particular city or neighborhood, or kind of community within a community. What does it look like to get to know? What does the gospel have to say here in this place with all of its particularities?
Boy, I'm so glad to hear you use that phrase, contextualized ministry. We heard that when I joined CCO staff in the 1976. In our training, we learned that the incarnation leads us to get to know the place, to earn the right to be heard, to develop relationships. And our staff had a web of networks that would sort of help each other understand things. I mean, you just think of the theater culture at a campus where there's a good theater department, or you think of the science nerds and the STEM people that are doing research, or you think of the athletic community. We have some CCO people that are particularly specialized in working with coaches and people training at a very high level, sometimes in college athletics, but they're in a whole nother world, these college athletes. And so whether you talk about the Greek culture, the fraternity and sorority scene, whether it's a fairly urbane and sophisticated college, or whether it's a community college in a local rural area or a poor neighborhood, college campuses are not even all the same. Sometimes I hear cultural critics these days, particularly kind of conservative ones, I think these days, are very alarmed about what goes on college campuses. And they write these articles about, what's going on universities. And I'm thinking, have they ever been on one? Because you could go to so many different universities, and the picture they paint of all the alarmist things going on, you might not even see at all. And I know you've been on a couple of campuses. You've worked at a couple of churches near a couple of different campuses in different parts of this state. And I know you've seen it, Sam. We've talked about this, that even relatively similar state colleges here in Pennsylvania have really different ethos and different kind of students and different sort of feels. So anyway, the cultures of the West make for an interesting mix. But if the gospel is true, and if we really love people in these institutions that God has put them in, then we've got to be attentive to that. There's no one size fits all cookie cutter gospel message. It needs to be at least translated somehow into the realities. And so they call that cultural apologetics. One author that has sort of helped us get at this, probably a really important guy who's in fact got some connections to the CCO before he died, and that's Timothy Keller, who was a PCA pastor in New York City, founded a church there called Redeemer, that grew mightily in a day and age back a couple of decades ago when nobody thought you could do an evangelical church plant of any success in Manhattan. And with a fairly conventional message and a fairly intellectual style, he developed a network of people that cared about the gospel for all of life. And he proclaimed the kingdom of God, and now has a whole network of Redeemer churches doing great, great stuff. But Tim has always been attentive to the questions of what happens in post-Christendom, in secularized Manhattan, where people are making idols out of money and sex, and success, prestige, the counterfeit gods, as he called them. And before he died, he wrote a little booklet. It was based on a speech he gave called How to Reach the West Again. Now, this really does actually kind of play into this one big motif of the West. And he admits that that's a bit of a simplification, and that the granular particulars in any given location are going to offer uniqueness to those places. But there are some basic themes that we can look at when we look at post-Christian West. And so he gives 6 what he calls essential elements of a missionary encounter. The fact that he talks about a missionary encounter, in fact, is itself a clue to some of what we mean by cultural apologetics. We could go back to books like The Gospel in a Pluralistic Society by Leslie Newbigin, or his great book, a thinner book by Newbigin, published in the 80s, called Foolishness to the Greeks. Newbigin was a British missionary that went to South India most of his life, lived there for a generation, and eventually in his retirement years left his lovely Lutheran church in India as a missionary, moved to his home back in England, and he said he could no longer recognize the place, that the given mores and cultures and biblical basis that might have existed even 50 years earlier were gone. And so he said, what I have to do now, as I return home to secularized London, is to do what I did when I went to India for the first time. I have to come to know the culture. I have to learn their language. I have to pay attention to their symbols. I have to ask what those symbols mean. I have to build a bridge with the culture in which we live, so when I say stuff about the gospel, they have a clue what the heck I'm talking about. Out of Newbigin's work became a movement that everybody's heard about now called the missional church movement, where sort of you take missionary principles where missionaries used to use when they were going to Africa or India, and we turn them on our own secularized neighbors and say, well, we should assume that our neighbors are not believers. They did not grow up in churches. They don't know what the prodigal son is. You can't make allusions to the gospel and expect people to know what you're talking about. And so we got to sort of pay attention to the language and culture and mores of the people with whom we live. Well, that missional church approach, where you begin to sort of use missional principles to understand the secularized West, is sort of what is driving Tim to write this little book, How to Reach the West Again. I thought I'd just read a couple of little chapter sections it's a short little book, but as he's looking at the post-Christian West, he says that today's culture believes that the thing we need salvation from is the very idea that we need salvation. Many people think that the church is no longer neutral or benign. They've heard of them. They go to weddings maybe. And they actually think it's a bad thing. They think churches are restrictive and that the gospel is bad news, not good news. And so the challenge of an evangelism in a post-Christian world is going to be to have to sort of build a bridge to help people understand how to form Christian people in an age where they may be not just skeptical or ignorant, but actually hostile. And then another layer of that, he says, we're in a digital culture, which has created a whole nother layer of interesting confusion, the role of technology and the lack of relationships and so forth. In reclaiming conversation, Sherry Turkle at MIT has given some ways to help us have good conversations because conversation patterns have changed in the digital age. And so it's sort of one of the bitter fruits of the secular project, he says, is that the first effort in history to build a cohesive societies without a common set of shared moral and religious values. If we don't share some moral language and consistent values, if there's no sort of consensus about the very basic things of what is right and wrong, then you're going to have a culture that's fragmented and hostile and pluralized, not just pluralized, but polarized. And so in this fragmented culture of polarization, we're going to have to think about that a little bit. And he gives you some ways to consider that, some really good insights and some good footnotes. And then he goes into the elements of a missionary encounter, and he actually lists some theory that you need to do, some kind of critical theory, if you will, to analyze the culture. And again, that's just really interesting stuff to give you a thumbnail sketch if you want to dive into this just in a couple of quick pages. The truly post-Christian dynamic is what we're trying to get at, so we can have authentic evangelism in that very setting. He says, how do you pay attention? How do you get people's attention in this kind of a world? And let me just read one little part. He quotes from the CCO's friend Alan Noble, who's written a couple of books on this stuff. He says, the greatest challenge today is to stimulate a significantly sized percentage of Christians to intentionally adopt missional living in their daily lives and relationships. So we got to get us all on board to be able to present a common picture of missional work. But that's hard in a digital age. Why? He says all worldviews that are not biblically based are like a suit of clothes that are too small. Such clothes always uncomfortably pinch, and occasionally they actually rip. The late modern view of reality and the self does not fit human nature as God designed it. There are times in which stories and art reveal how today's beliefs pinch and fail to satisfy. There are other times, especially times of pain, when the late modern worldview actually just rips and wholly fails to provide what is needed to face such experiences. He says Christians need to be prepared. He uses Alan Noble's notion from disruptive witness to get at this, that we have to be prepared in these moments when people are feeling like their worldviews aren't suiting. They don't have answers for the deepest things of the longings of their heart. Their clothes that they've put on are too snug. And the gospel can set people free from that. But we have to be aware of what's going on in that. And he uses Alan Noble's quote to sort of get at that a little bit, this disruptive witness that we bring when we realize that people come to sort of experience that in pain or in movies or in songs, that something deeper is going on and that their current worldview just doesn't cut it. So he says, once you've attracted people, you've got to demonstrate the truth of the gospel in a pluralistic world. You've got to show certain kind of convictions, good news and bad news. And he says how to do that. He says we need to offer a category-defying social vision, which is to say we can't let people think we're primarily right-wing or left-wing. We're not just recanting the same worldly ideologies. We're offering a fresh hope of an alternative way to live that's truly godly and truly category defying. And that surprising consistency in a high view of the human dignity is going to really shock people into seeing, wow, these Christians have something unique to say. I mean, just think of the way some people are both against abortion and the death penalty. You know, they're pro-peace and they're pro-life. You know, you get this, like, who thinks like that anymore? It's not left-wing, it's not right-wing, it's a completely comprehensive new worldview. And we're showing that over and over, whether it's in our understanding of sexuality or our understanding of human dignity. We kind of live that out, and he thinks that's part of the sort of basis for doing that well. Well, anyway, this How to Reach the West, again, gives these 6 elements of how to have a missionary encounter that's savvy to the culture and paying attention to the ideologies of the age. And I just think that's a brilliant little thing. If Christianity is declining in the West, as it seems to be, churches in North America are closing. We've got to do something about this, and we've got to be equipped well to do a cultural kind of apologetics that proclaims the gospel in a way that's effective and substantial.
Yeah, that's great. And it dives into that in a way that's not like what we often encounter when topics like that and these ideologies come up in conversation, which is that kind of culture war mentality. That's not what Keller's doing here. He's talking about understanding where people are at. And like you said, what does the gospel have to speak to those particularities?
Yeah, thanks for underlining that, because that is really true. Part of the humility of cultural apologetics is trying to understand the world. Now, granted, we may want to be critical of it. When we point out to people, your clothes are too small. This worldview just is too constrictive. Who can live like that with this naturalistic worldview that there's nothing more than meets the eye? C.S. Lewis used to go after that in books like The Abolition of Man, and Tolkien in Lord of the Rings was offering a vision of life that was more substantial and rich and multifaceted than the reductionism of the Enlightenment. I mean, those of us that are watching the brilliant Ken Burn thing that just started this week as we're recording here on the American Revolution, you know, are inspired by these early American revolutionaries that had these new ideas about democracy and so forth. But you know what? Some of them were shaped by the Enlightenment that says there's nothing true but progress and ideals that can be adopted by the human mind. Thomas Paine's common sense, this stuff from Aristotle even. There's got to be more than just that. And I think postmodern folks know that the American Enlightenment project is not enough. And so this isn't culture warring. We're not just trying to yell at people and say our way is better. We're inviting people to understand what's really true out there. And one of the keys of cultural apologetics, we've heard this phrase and we use it in the CC, that we're trying to tell a better story, that everybody lives their life in terms of some imaginative construct, some dream of what's good and beautiful, good and true and beautiful. And so out of these dreams come stories and novels and movies and rock songs and country songs. And so as we listen to the artists, they sort of get there first. They sort of start to say stuff about what's wrong with the world before most of us have caught on in our mind. But we resonate with that stuff. And so we use the arts maybe now more than ever to tell a better story. You can't just convince somebody that Jesus rose from the dead and expect them to become disciples of Jesus just because we kind of intellectually argued them into it. We have to offer a whole story, a way to live. And so we use the arts and we use music and we use drama and we use illustrations. A whole book that gets at that really, really well is this major new hardback. It's called The Gospel After Christendom. This is the second one I want to talk about. We could talk about so many more. I have a bibliography, in fact, I can send if anybody's interested in books on cultural apologetics. But this one right here is called The Gospel After Christendom, an introduction to cultural apologetics. It's edited by Collin, Hansen, Skylar Flowers, and Ivan Mesa. These three people are scholars in residence at the Timothy Keller Center for studying this stuff. So they sort of started up a center in honor of Keller's work. And this sort of is the first major book that's come out of this think tank honored after Timothy Keller, and the book is dedicated to him. And they say that we need cultural climatologists. That's what Hansen says in the foreword. The climatologists that look at the lay of the land, that look at the topography, that look at what's changing and the changing climate in which we live. Well, we need people to do that well about our culture. And so they have 3 essays: Is Cultural Apologetics a tool for evangelism, a biblical vision, and a framework for retrieval of the best ideas of the past? Joshua Trottrow has a great chapter on that, looking at Augustine and his cultural apologetics under the Roman Empire. But the second part is, how is cultural apologetics done? I mentioned Alan Noble has a great chapter in here. Daniel Strange, who's a really sharp guy. Gray Suntanto, who's a Kuiper scholar. Gavin Ortland has a nice little chapter in here. And then there's a chapter called What Questions Does Cultural Apologetics Answer? And one of the questions, the British woman Rebecca McLaughlin has a chapter in here, is a question that everybody sort of intuits: is Christianity good for the world? People want to know, does this stuff work? Is it just one more system that's going to put us down? Or could it in fact set us free to get beyond the polarities of left and right, and beyond the socialist worldview that fell with communism, and the capitalist worldview that seems to be eating up the world even as we speak? Like, how do you get beyond everything? Is Christianity really healthy? Is it good? Could it provide answers? And her chapter is really good. Rachel Gilson has a chapter called Is Christianity Beautiful? And that's part of the same question. Is there something beautiful about Christianity that is bigger than just data and facts? And then the next question is it true? So those 3 questions, the good, the beautiful, and the true, are in that next section. And then the fourth section is, where does cultural apologetics happen? And it talks about the church. It talks about front porches. James Englington has a chapter in there, why we need front porches. They don't even build front porches much anymore because neighborhoods aren't what they used to be. And we need to rethink about street level apologetics of hanging out with our neighbors more. Everyday life, he says, what are the texts that shape us? Sam Chan has a chapter on that. So this is a really great collection of essays, even if you don't like every single chapter. Heck, even if you don't even read every single chapter, there's enough meat to get you going in here to begin to think about cultural apologetics better. Every single church in America needs to be asking this question, whether you're urban or rural, whether you're sophisticated or down home, whether you're Orthodox or whether you're Baptist. Everybody's in this modern Western post-cultural world. And we've got to figure out how to make the gospel make sense, living it and saying it well, so that our neighbors can hear us. So I think that book is real important. I don't agree with even everything that's in it, but I think there's enough good stuff in there that I highly commend it. CCO people are going to have to work on this in a way as we deal with the rising generation of 17-year-olds that are hitting campus. And those of us that are in more established churches working with aging baby boomers, we've got to deal with it as well, and everybody in between. Can I tell you about one more book, one third one?
Yes, please.
Well, the last one I want to tell you about is called Evangelism in an Age of Despair. It's by Andrew Root. And I know you know the name Andrew Root, Sam. We might even have talked about some of his work in other podcasts. He is teaching at a Lutheran seminary. His wife's a Presbyterian pastor, PCUSA pastor, and he's written about 5 or 6 books analyzing the culture with the most astute philosophical lenses you can imagine. He looks at Charles Taylor. He looks at other main sociologists and thinkers of the day, the people that are on the cutting edge of sociology and philosophy. He engages them and then puts the gospel in conversation with them around a particular theme. And the books include stuff like our fascination with youth and what that does to youth ministry in churches and how we understand our churches if we're kind of stuck in that. What happens when churches are in decline in an age of revitalization? What do you do with the notions of newness? You know, everybody wants to be innovative, and we have all these talks at places like TED Talks and Q, all looking for the next bright, good thing. Well, maybe churches don't need innovation. What happens? How do you do church in an age when innovation isn't necessarily the goal? What do you do about churches that are interested in the gospel in an age when people are interested in anti-Christian spiritualities? So this guy is just fascinating, looking at the lay of the land and writing books about church health in the midst of that. Well, this one, he takes a little bit of a different posture because he's not looking at church life and congregational life in this culture, but he's actually asking how we do evangelism in this culture. Now, again, some people just like to do evangelism in simple ways and ask people if they're saved and tell them about the Romans road and get people saved. God bless them if that works for anybody, but I don't think it does much. People are afraid of it. They want to be so sensitive to their neighbors and not look like a person on a crusade that they don't want to share the gospel hardly at all. And of course, we in the CCO are walking that balance to trying to do it well, sensitively and caringly, but proclaim the good news of Jesus, who is the only Savior that we know. So yeah, we got to do it. And we got to do it well. Well, he tries to get at what the culture is like, and he suggests in this book that we are in an age of despair, that there are both philosophers and in ordinary people's lives enough bad news that we've almost given up any notion of hope. He has a narrative running through this, a fictional story of a woman who comes to faith and then faces some hard times, and her story keeps coming out sort of through the book, making it very, very interesting. I mean, this is like almost 300 pages, lots of footnotes. It's academic to a fault. But yet he has these playful stories in here, and he's trying to ask, what does it mean to do evangelism when people believe that promises always fail? They have no hope for anything, so nothing can be good news. They're cynical, but it's beyond cynicism because they're actually hurting. Does any of that make sense to you, Sam? Have you sort of heard any of this conversation about the way in which our culture has shifted increasingly to be hopeless?
Absolutely. That this is an important conversation in college ministry, but I think more broadly, where I think a lot of times we talk about apologetics. We talk about these kind of rational arguments for the truth of the Christian faith, and that's important stuff. But I think oftentimes, even when there are conversations along those lines, if you dig a little bit, if you ask some perceptive questions, oftentimes you'll find there's something at a deeper level than just the rational going on there. There's a hopelessness, and there's a grappling with not just what kind of makes intellectual sense to me, but what actually offers hope for my life. I think of an interaction I had with the student where a number of years ago when I was working on campus and was interacting with a student that was not a Christian, was very skeptical, and had all these kind of skeptical questions about how do we know we can trust the Bible. And we were kind of talking at that level, but it eventually came to a point in the conversation where I surfaced that she had had some significant hurt in her family's life at the hands of Christian ministers. And so there was this deeper question of, is this something that I can actually stake my hope in? And that's where the skepticism really was, more so than, kind of the validity of Scripture. Both important, but that question of hope is often there under the surface.
Well, this book gets at that kind of stuff deeply. It is an astounding contribution to the kind of cultural assessment of the issues of the day, analyzing where people are at and how the gospel can make sense to people, whether you're a mainline denominational person, whether you're an evangelical that's comfortable with gospel language. This is a deep and hopeful view of evangelism. And let me just kind of jump to the chase. You can hardly summarize this multifaceted, rich book easily. It's one of these things you're going to spend a year working on. But one of the summary points is that we need to be heralds of a good news by way of offering consolation. That's a word that he used. Ignatius talked about consolation, that we need to walk with people in their dark times. We need to have solidarity with the hurting. And so we have a gospel that's based on the cross. I don't know if Root is Lutheran. He teaches at a Lutheran seminary, but this way of the cross stuff is very Lutheran, that we follow a suffering Savior. And so there is something to the good news that is less than triumphalistic and is more about suffering. And as we offer a good news of consolation with those that are hurting, I am sure, Sam, when that conversation shifted from the truth claims of the gospel to the pain that person felt from toxic faith, that all of a sudden you could put your arm around that person in a new way and offer consolation. And that's where the things begin to happen, when people begin to open up and good news can really be proclaimed in a way that is sensible and calming and helpful, because you're offering consolation. This is really an astounding work, and I can't say enough about its cultural astuteness, as all of Root's books are, and also this sensitivity to the hurting. It's a creative, fascinating book, an invaluable study for these purposes. So I gave you one really, really short little one that introduces the notion of kind of a missionary encounter with the West. I gave you the kind of classic new one that is really an important reader on cultural apologetics. And then I gave you one that probably doesn't even use the word cultural apologetics, but is doing it par excellence by analyzing the world in which we live and offering good news to a hurting culture. Now, these are some of the things I know CCO people talk about all the time, and they're so busy doing it that they might not have time to read up on it. But these are the resources that are going to strengthen and undergird the conversations we have as we try to figure out how to best represent the kingdom of God on our campuses day by day.
Yeah, and so if you're working in vocational ministry, these are important kinds of reads for us to be digging into. But if you're not, this might feel like shop talk for those of us who are in vocational ministry. But really, these are the kinds of questions that every Christian needs to be wrestling with, of where do I live? Where has God called me to be? What is the unique particularities that I find there? How can I be a student of the culture in which I find myself, so that I can be discerning in what does it look like to offer the consolation of the gospel to the people around me?
Talk to any parent that has a young kid. There's new vocabulary and new cultural practices and habits and internet trends that the parents are scratching their head about. Like, everybody has to cross cultural bridges day by day, no matter who you are. So this is not just for those in vocational ministry, and we're all called to bear witness to the good news the best we can. So you're right. It is not just for those like CCO workers who are kind of professional evangelists, but for any of us who are salt and light in the world. Hey, can I say one more thing about this cultural stuff? I'll just give a shout out to this, because again, the CCO gets this really well. One of the ways, I think, to use imagination and storytelling to invite people to a better story is to present a different kind of the gospel than probably what is caricatured as fundamentalism on the radio or the TV. Whenever TV shows are making fun of religion, they have this sort of caricature of either a really liberal priest or a really conservative fundamentalist. There are better ways to be Christian, and one of the best ways to do that is to hold people up the vision of what we're doing. And we do that at Jubilee every year in February. We have this big conference of which thousands of college students come. And the day before, a whole bunch of hundreds of adults come for Jubilee Professional. And they talk about the the warp and woof of the kingdom of God woven into every area of life, whether it's vocation or calling or politics or art or science. And they have speakers from sports stars to scientists to media people, sharing the mind of Christ for making a difference in the world for the common good. Man, when students come to something like Jubilee and they see a better way to be Christian that isn't constrictive or culturally accommodated, that's really unique and different, many of them leave that conference and they say, I've never seen such a thing. I kind of knew what religion was, but now my mind is blown. So I think that's a great way to do culturally savvy apologetics, is to tell a better story by inviting people to see it live for a couple of days and spend the rest of their life figuring out what it all means. It's our 50th anniversary of Jubilee this year, and so I'm going to be there, and I'm hoping everybody listening to this podcast would get it on their schedule and meet us in Pittsburgh this February.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, thank you, Byron, and thank you all for listening. We appreciate you. If you'd like to order any of these books, click the first link you find in the episode description. We'd love for you to tell your friends about the show, like and share on whatever platforms you use, point people towards episodes that you think would be helpful for them. And we'd love to hear from you. Comment or send us an email and let us know what are you reading, what do you find helpful. If you have any personalized book recommendations that you want from Byron, he'd be happy to share that with you. And we hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving and however you're spending that. And we're grateful for you. For Byron, Hearts and Minds Books, and the CCO, this has been another episode of the 3 Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. Thanks, friends.